On the 2nd of November 1700, a royal clerk in Madrid faced a practical problem. The king had died the previous day, and the next order could not be copied until the clerk knew which name belonged at its head. Charles II had left no child. He had left something almost as consequential, a will that named a successor to the kingdoms and overseas possessions governed in his name. The will itself had passed through a controlled chain of custody. Councillors needed an authorised text, not a rumour from the palace. Once its provisions were read and copied, messengers carried the result outward. The first drama of the succession was therefore administrative. Before any army marched, governments had to decide whether the paper arriving from Madrid could determine the future of Europe. For an official serving far from Castile, the delay mattered. A governor in Naples or a treasury officer in the Americas might continue working for weeks under arrangements created by a dead king. When the new royal name finally arrived, it did not merely announce a family event. It told the official which appointments remained valid and which distant court could demand obedience. The document did not describe an empty throne waiting for Europe to choose its owner. It presented a decision already made. Charles designated Philip, Duke of Anjou, the second grandson of Louis XIV of France. Philip was to receive the Spanish monarchy intact. If he could not inherit, the will provided another sequence. But its central demand was clear. The monarchy was not to be broken into convenient pieces for foreign governments. That demand made sense inside Madrid. Spain was not a single administrative bloc. A merchant appealing a customs decision in Castile did not follow the same institutions as a landholder in Aragon. Naples and Milan possessed their own offices. The Spanish Netherlands and the American kingdoms also followed distinct legal traditions. They were connected because one monarch ruled them, not because one ministry governed them all in the same way. A succession therefore involved more than placing a crown on one head. Officials across several continents needed to know whether existing laws and appointments, together with debts and privileges, would continue under the same royal authority. Partition might satisfy a foreign mapmaker. It could also break the chain through which thousands of ordinary decisions were made. The will tried to prevent that break. It also tried to prevent another outcome. Philip's position in the French royal family meant that he or his descendants might one day approach the throne of France. Charles's settlement required the two crowns to remain separate. The document attempted to preserve the Spanish inheritance without creating a single Franco-Spanish monarchy. Charles had reached this decision after years in which every report about his health altered diplomatic calculation. Foreign courts prepared alternatives, while Spanish ministers tried to keep control of a succession that outsiders already treated as an international problem. The final will was decisive inside the monarchy, but it arrived after other governments had invested time and political prestige in different solutions. This is why the inheritance could not be judged by genealogy alone. A claimant's bloodline supplied a legal argument. His family's military resources and diplomatic connections determined how threatening that argument appeared. Philip was acceptable to Madrid partly because he was not weak. Europe feared him for the same reason. The difficulty was that Europe did not have to trust the document's intention. France was already the strongest monarchy on the continent. Louis XIV had spent decades expanding French influence along the Rhine and in the Low Countries. Now his grandson might command Spain's ports and European territories, together with access to American trade. Even without a formal legal merger, the two courts could coordinate policy in ways that altered the security of every neighbouring state. In Versailles, the decision came down to another document. Louis could reject the will and return to the partition arrangements he had negotiated with other powers. Or he could accept the entire inheritance for Philip and risk a wider confrontation. Acceptance preserved the Spanish monarchy for his grandson. It also placed the Bourbon family at the centre of a question. No treaty had yet settled. How much power could one dynasty hold before other governments treated it as a common danger? The danger was not merely that France might annex Spain. A Dutch official thinking about the southern Netherlands would ask who controlled the fortresses near the Republic's frontier. An English merchant would ask whether French influence could close Spanish markets. An imperial minister would see Habsburg claims disappearing from Italy and the Western Mediterranean. Each government could fear a different consequence and still oppose the same inheritance. For the clerk in Madrid, these calculations were far away. His immediate task was to copy the royal style correctly and send instructions through institutions that had not stopped working when Charles died. The continuity was real. Courts opened and taxes were recorded. Ships still required licenses. Yet every order now carried a name that would tell Europe whether the monarchy had passed to the Bourbons. Louis XIV accepted the will for his grandson. Philip would travel south as Philip V of Spain. The choice did not unite the two monarchies by law, and several governments initially recognized him. What it did was remove the partition that foreign powers had expected and replace it with a test of confidence. Could Europe believe that a French prince would govern the whole Spanish inheritance without allowing France to benefit from it? The first answer would not come from a battlefield. It would come from the actions taken after the proclamation, which troops entered Spanish fortresses and which merchants received access. France's treatment of other royal claims would matter as well. The will had supplied a king. It had not supplied the trust required to make his inheritance acceptable. A document intended to keep the Spanish monarchy together had therefore created two risks at once. Dividing the inheritance might destroy its political coherence. Preserving it under Philip might strengthen the Bourbon dynasty beyond what other states would tolerate. Europe would spend the next years trying to escape one danger without producing the other. Before Charles II died, diplomats had already drawn borders through his inheritance. On a working map in London, The Hague, or Versailles, the Spanish monarchy could be separated with a few lines. Spain and its American kingdoms might remain together. Italian territories could compensate another claimant. A frontier province could be moved to reassure a neighbour. The lines looked orderly, because the map did not show the institutions they would divide. The map offered a seductive kind of control. A diplomat could move a coloured boundary without hearing the objections of a provincial court or calculating how long news would take to cross the Atlantic. Partition appeared peaceful because the violence had been removed from the drawing. The officials expected to implement it would have discovered the conflict later. Joseph Ferdinand's position made the first plan seem unusually clever. He could inherit the central monarchy without bringing the resources of France or Austria with him. Yet the design depended on the life of one child. His death did not merely replace a name in the treaty. It removed the person around whom the rival powers had temporarily organized their restraint. The first major partition plan in 1698 placed the young electoral Prince Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria at its center. He was a child, but that was part of his usefulness. He belonged neither to the French Bourbons nor to the Austrian Habsburg branch that wanted Spain. Giving him the central inheritance appeared to prevent either great dynasty from taking everything. The arrangement solved one problem by creating several others. France and Austria expected compensation in Europe. Spain had not negotiated the plan. Its councils were being asked to accept that foreign rulers could decide which territories belonged together before their king was dead. The solution treated the monarchy as transferable property, while many Spanish officials understood its integrity as a condition of political survival. Then Joseph Ferdinand died in February 1699. A child chosen to prevent a European confrontation disappeared from the succession before he could inherit anything. The governments that had relied on him returned to their maps. Their second plan placed Archduke Charles closer to the Spanish throne, while reserving major Italian gains for France. This created a different imbalance. If Charles received Spain together with the overseas monarchy and the Spanish Netherlands, the Austrian Habsburgs would recover a Western inheritance of enormous scale. If France received compensation in Italy, it would gain positions that other states considered strategically dangerous. Moving one line to contain one dynasty could strengthen another. Spanish resistance to partition was not simply pride in a large map. The monarchy's credit and military obligations, together with its diplomatic treaties, had been created under a common sovereign. Detaching territories could leave creditors uncertain about payment and officers uncertain about service. A peaceful division required thousands of secondary decisions that the partition treaties had not settled. There was also a problem of precedent. If foreign powers could redesign the monarchy before Charles died, they would establish that Spanish territories could be exchanged whenever European equilibrium required it. The final will defended more than Philip. It defended the principle that the monarchy's own succession should determine which territories remained connected. In Madrid, the problem appeared in a different form. A royal council did not merely govern territory. It carried records and procedures, as well as appointments and obligations. If Naples were detached, officials would need to know what happened to debts contracted under the Spanish crown. If the Netherlands passed elsewhere, garrisons and provincial privileges would require a new sovereign. The map was simple, because the administrative consequences had not yet been written onto it. Charles II's own decisions changed, as factions at court and foreign pressure shifted. At one stage, Joseph Ferdinand appeared as a means of preserving most of the monarchy. After the Bavarian prince's death, the final will turned to Philip of Anjou. The choice was not simply a victory for France inside the royal bedchamber. It reflected the belief that accepting a powerful Bourbon heir might be safer than allowing the inheritance to be divided. That belief was understandable and dangerous. A weak heir might fail to protect a dispersed monarchy. A strong heir might protect it so effectively that his family gained influence over Europe. The same quality that made Philip useful to Madrid made him alarming in London and Vienna, as well as The Hague. The partition treaties also revealed a deeper weakness in European diplomacy. The powers could agree that no claimant should receive too much. They could not agree on what counted as too much. A port that seemed like modest compensation to one government might command a sea route vital to another. An Italian duchy could matter because it connected military roads rather than because of its size. For a Spanish official preparing an inventory of royal territories, every proposed division therefore raised a practical question: which archives and revenues, and which soldiers or legal appeals followed the transferred land? No international plan had a complete answer. The negotiators were trying to prevent war by distributing the inheritance, but each distribution changed the resources available for the next war. When Louis XIV accepted Charles's final will, he abandoned the second partition arrangement. From his perspective, rejecting a legally offered inheritance would hand advantage to the Habsburgs. From the perspective of the maritime powers, acceptance removed a compromise that had limited Bourbon gains. Both readings could be defended, and neither produced confidence. Europe had now tested two kinds of solution. A neutral child could preserve the central inheritance, but he did not live. A negotiated partition could limit each dynasty. But Spain resisted being divided, and the powers disputed the compensation. The intact Bourbon succession remained, because the alternatives had failed. It would soon show that preserving the monarchy on paper did not prevent outsiders from entering its fortresses and markets, then its councils. When Philip reached Madrid in early 1701, the most important change was not visible in his clothes or his accent. It appeared at the top of official papers. Councils that had served Charles II began issuing decisions in the name of Philip V. A new dynasty became real each time a court accepted an appointment, a treasury honoured an order, or a town recognised the royal seal. The journey from Versailles to Madrid had therefore changed the scale of Philip's life before it changed his legal identity. He had been raised as a younger French prince, not as the expected ruler of a dispersed monarchy. In Spain, ceremonies and oaths had to place him inside political traditions that existed long before the Bourbons arrived. A public ceremony could display acceptance, but government depended on quieter repetitions. Councillors submitted papers and secretaries prepared replies. Provincial bodies sought confirmation of their privileges. Philip's monarchy accumulated authority through these transactions. Every successful exchange made it harder to describe him as a visitor waiting to be removed. Philip was 17. He arrived with the prestige of Louis XIV behind him, but he could not govern Spain as an extension of Versailles without weakening the inheritance he had come to preserve. The monarchy depended on institutions that expected the king to confirm their laws and privileges. His authority would be stronger if he appeared as Spain's king rather than France's representative. This produced an immediate tension. French support helped defend the succession, yet visible French control made the succession look dangerous abroad and intrusive at home. Advisors from France entered important discussions. French military power guarded the dynasty. Spanish councils continued to process government. The boundary between assistance and domination could not be measured by a single decree. The clearest alarm came from the Spanish Netherlands. French troops entered barrier fortresses that had previously contained garrisons connected to Dutch security arrangements. To the Dutch Republic, this was not a distant family question. Soldiers loyal to Louis XIV now occupied positions near the Republic's frontier in the name of his grandson. At a port, the political meaning of cooperation could be hidden inside ordinary commercial language. A manifest listed cargo and destination. A license identified the company permitted to trade. The paper did not announce that Europe's balance was changing, but foreign merchants could calculate who was receiving access that had previously been denied. This helped transform suspicion into policy. England and the Dutch Republic did not need proof that France had annexed Spain. They needed evidence that the succession was changing fortresses and markets in France's favour. The difference between legal union and strategic advantage became central to the approaching war. Commercial decisions deepened the concern. French merchants gained privileged access to Spanish-American trade, including the contract connected with supplying enslaved Africans to the Spanish colonies. At a customs desk, the change could appear as a license bearing recognised authority. In London or Amsterdam, the same license suggested that France might use Philip's inheritance to redirect trade. The two crowns still had separate laws and councils, with separate finances. Philip had not become King of France. Louis XIV had not become King of Spain, yet the practical advantages of family cooperation were appearing before Europe had accepted the legal guarantees of separation. Another decision widened the dispute beyond Spain. After the death of the exiled James II in 1701, Louis XIV recognised his son as king in the three kingdoms of England, Scotland and Ireland. William III's government regarded this as interference in the English succession and a breach of the recent European settlement. The Spanish inheritance was now linked to a second, contested crown. For English and Dutch ministers, the pattern mattered more than any single action. French troops had moved into strategic fortresses. French commerce had entered protected markets. Louis had supported a rival claimant to William's throne. A Bourbon king in Madrid might remain legally distinct from France, but French policy was making that distinction difficult to trust. Inside Spain, Philip's position was not simply imposed by foreign soldiers. Many institutions accepted Charles II's will, and large parts of the monarchy had reasons to prefer an intact inheritance. A change of dynasty could offer protection from partition. It could also promise stronger military support after years of weakness. These expectations did not mean universal enthusiasm, and they did not produce uniform loyalty in every territory. A provincial official receiving an order from Madrid therefore faced fewer immediate doubts than a foreign ambassador might imagine. The seal was valid. The council that issued it was functioning. The king had been named by the previous monarch, Unless local politics created another choice, obedience could look like continuity rather than revolution. Europe's governments initially had room to accept Philip under conditions. What reduced that room was the accumulation of actions suggesting that France intended to enjoy the strategic value of Spain while insisting that the crowns remained separate. The conflict was moving away from the wording of Charles's will and toward the credibility of Bourbon restraint. Philip had obtained the title that European diplomacy had tried to distribute. He had not yet obtained uncontested possession of the monarchy. To challenge him, his opponents would need more than a rival genealogy. They would need an alliance capable of fighting in several regions, and a Habsburg prince who could persuade Spanish institutions to use his royal name instead. The alliance formed against Bourbon power did not begin with a shared picture of victory. In 1701, negotiators could agree that French influence had advanced too far. They could not yet agree on how Spain should be governed when the war ended. The treaty joining England and the Dutch Republic together with Emperor Leopold was therefore both a military commitment and a postponed argument. The postponement was useful. A treaty could identify common enemies and immediate safeguards without resolving every future border. This allowed the coalition to mobilize quickly. It also meant that the hardest disagreement was built into the alliance from its first pages. The original compact was not yet a simple declaration that Charles must rule all Spain. Its members sought security and commercial access under firm limits on French power. As the conflict developed, support for Carlos III became a clearer means of achieving those aims. The means would later be mistaken for a goal every ally valued equally. A Dutch frontier officer saw the problem through fortresses. The Republic needed a defensible barrier in the Spanish Netherlands because an army stationed there could reach Dutch territory quickly. Whether Philip remained king mattered less to that officer than who controlled the nearby garrisons, and whether France could use them. An English merchant saw a different danger. Spanish and American markets were regulated through royal privileges and licenses, including monopolies. If French merchants received special access under Philip, English shipping could lose opportunities without any formal union of crowns. Parliament would be asked to finance a war whose benefits had to be explained in trade as well as territory. Leopold's court carried the strongest dynastic claim. The emperor wanted the inheritance for his own house, and eventually advanced his younger son, Archduke Charles, as Carlos III. Yet even the Habsburg objective contained a future problem. A prince who received all of Spain might later inherit extensive Austrian lands, recreating the concentration of power the maritime allies claimed to oppose. For the moment, that danger appeared distant. The immediate task was to contain France and secure satisfactory guarantees. The alliance could operate because each member expected the war to improve its own position. It did not require them to value every objective equally. This was visible in the documents that financed the coalition. English and later British armies depended on parliamentary supply. Money had to be voted and borrowed, then accounted for and defended against political criticism. The Dutch carried heavy military and financial obligations close to their own frontier. The emperor contributed dynastic legitimacy and continental forces, but also depended on subsidies and allied cooperation. Marlborough's position illustrates why coalition war was political even before battle began. A route chosen for military reasons could alarm the Dutch if it appeared to neglect their frontier. A campaign useful to the emperor might require British subsidies that Parliament expected to justify. Command consisted partly of keeping several definitions of necessity aligned for one more season. The financial machinery made prolonged war possible and made its costs visible. Public borrowing could support armies on a scale unavailable to many earlier rulers. But debt created records that survived battlefield celebrations. Each year of success arrived with another calculation of interest and taxation, under continued political consent. A pay order for a regiment therefore carried the alliance's hidden tension. The soldiers might serve in the same campaign, while the governments paying them expected different results. One treasury wanted secure commerce. Another wanted frontier protection. The Habsburg court wanted a Spanish king from its own dynasty. Cooperation did not erase these distinctions. It delayed their consequences. The death of William III in 1702 did not end English participation. Queen Anne inherited the conflict and the political burden of sustaining it. Under her government, John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, became both a military commander and a crucial manager of coalition relations. His task involved moving armies without allowing the separate governments behind them to lose confidence in one another. The alliance also expanded. Portugal joined, giving Allied forces a route into Spain from the west. Savoy changed sides, affecting the war in northern Italy. These decisions were not acts of devotion to Charles. Smaller powers calculated which coalition could best protect their territory or improve their position after peace. Archduke Charles's proclamation as king gave the alliance a clearer alternative to Philip, but it did not make his claim effective in Spain. A royal title issued abroad required towns and councils, together with courts and military forces willing to recognize it. The coalition could carry Charles to the peninsula. It could not guarantee that Spanish institutions would receive him. The alliance was strongest when its members faced an immediate French threat. It would become weaker whenever victory forced them to define the future more precisely. If Philip were removed, what would Britain receive? Where would Dutch security begin? How much of the Spanish inheritance could Charles hold without becoming another excessive dynastic power? Those questions did not prevent the armies from marching. They travelled with them. Before Charles could test his claim in Spain, the alliance would have to survive campaigns in Italy and the Low Countries before reaching the Atlantic and the Danube. Its first great achievements would protect the Habsburg cause, but they would not settle what the coalition was actually trying to build. In the autumn of 1705, an official in Barcelona could receive two claims to obedience. Each written in the language of lawful monarchy. Philip V. ruled from Madrid under Charles II's will. Archduke Charles arrived with an allied fleet, and the promise that the institutions of Catalonia would be respected. The choice was not between government and rebellion in the abstract. It was between two governments that each intended its orders to be copied and funded before being enforced. The Allied landing followed an agreement made with Catalan supporters of the Habsburg cause. Those supporters expected military protection and safeguards for their constitutional arrangements. Their decision did not bind every inhabitant of Catalonia, and it did not transform the principality into a modern national movement. It did create the institutional opening Charles needed. The approach to Barcelona had already shown how local and international interests could meet without becoming the same. Allied officers needed a secure port. Catalan participants wanted guarantees that would matter after the fleet departed. Charles needed both the ships outside the walls and the institutions inside them. The city's surrender did not erase negotiation. Capitulation terms and subsequent political acts shaped how Charles entered the existing order. He could not simply replace every office with foreign personnel and still claim that Spanish institutions had freely received him. His usefulness as an alternative king depended on governing through recognizable forms. Barcelona's position mattered because a claimant without a court remained a prince carried by foreign armies. Once the city capitulated to the Allies, Charles could establish a royal household and appoint officers capable of issuing commands as Carlos III. The title now appeared in a Spanish administrative setting, rather than only in imperial declarations abroad. A clerk copying one of those orders was doing more than changing the name at the top. He was helping construct a competing chain of authority. A tax request, a military appointment, or a supply contract could be valid under one king and treasonous under the other. The Civil War entered daily government through paperwork. The rivalry could divide a single family's calculations. A relative serving one administration might make another relative vulnerable when territory changed hands. Property documents issued under Carlos III could later be questioned under Philip, and the reverse was also possible. Political allegiance became a legal risk carried into the future. This is why the phrase, "Spain chose two kings," must be handled carefully. There was no single national vote. Different institutions made decisions at different times under military pressure and inherited legal procedures. The result was still profound. Spain now contained two centres capable of claiming that obedience to the other was unlawful. Charles's supporters were not united by a single motive. Some defended local laws against the prospect of Bourbon centralisation. Some regarded the Habsburg claim as more legitimate. Others calculated that Allied naval and military power offered better protection for property or trade. These motives could overlap without becoming identical. Philip's supporters were equally varied. Castilian institutions generally continued to recognise him, but loyalty was not simply a regional instinct. Philip possessed Charles II's will and an operating court in Madrid, supported by French military assistance. For many officials, obedience to him meant continuing with the government already able to issue salaries and confirm appointments. The competition was therefore uneven. Charles held important territory in the east and enjoyed Allied support at sea. Philip controlled the political centre of the monarchy and most of the institutions that had first accepted the succession. Each side could call the other foreign. Each depended on foreign troops. The existence of two royal courts changed what military victory needed to accomplish. Capturing a city could transfer archives and customs offices, including their tax records, to another royal name. Yet those records were useful only if surrounding districts delivered revenue and local officers remained in place. A proclamation could announce Carlos III more quickly than an administration could make him effective. Barcelona also gave Charles a public answer to the charge that Spain had rejected him. He could point to institutions that recognized his title and to subjects who expected him to rule through their established laws. This strengthened his position in Allied diplomacy. It did not prove that the rest of the monarchy would follow. The new court created obligations. Soldiers required quarters. Ships needed supplies. Officials expected payment. Local supporters, who had accepted Charles because he promised protection, now expected him to protect the institutions through which they had acted. His claim became more credible and more expensive at the same moment. For an ordinary household, the royal dispute might arrive as a demand for lodging, a change in the coin accepted by an office, or a notice requiring service. A family did not need to understand every genealogical argument to know that choosing the wrong authority could expose property and livelihood when armies returned. Spain had not divided neatly into two permanent camps. Loyalties shifted under pressure, and towns made choices in different circumstances. What had changed was that the succession was no longer only a European dispute about a dead king's will. Two living kings now maintained Spanish courts, and both needed institutions willing to make their titles real. The alliance had given Charles the place from which to govern. It had not given him Madrid. To protect his cause, his Habsburg family would soon depend on a campaign far from Spain, where a French victory could remove Austria from the war, before Carlos III had time to turn Barcelona into a kingdom. In 1704, a supply receipt in a village near the Danube could record grain taken for armies fighting over the Spanish throne. The distance was not an accident. France and Bavaria were threatening the Habsburg position in Central Europe. If Vienna were forced out of the war, Archduke Charles could keep his title in Barcelona and still lose the dynasty capable of supporting it. The alliance therefore faced a strategic problem. Its armies in the Low Countries could pressure France without necessarily saving Austria. John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, moved his main force south and east, coordinating with imperial commanders while concealing enough of his intention to prevent French interference. A collapse in Austria would have changed the Spanish War without a French soldier entering Madrid. The emperor might have needed to recall troops, abandon campaigns in Italy, or negotiate from immediate weakness. Charles's court in Barcelona depended on a dynastic system whose centre lay hundreds of miles away. This explains why the coalition accepted the risks of Marlborough's march. The objective was not to win a symbolic battle in Germany. It was to prevent France from removing one of the alliance's indispensable members, and thereby deciding the Spanish succession indirectly. The march itself required administration on a continental scale. Horses needed fodder, and soldiers needed bread. Local authorities received demands from an army moving beyond its expected theatre. A commander could describe a bold manoeuvre in a dispatch. Villages experienced it as carts and requisitions that delayed harvest work. The route crossed jurisdictions that did not all answer to the same ruler. Passage had to be negotiated and supplies promised. Discipline had to be maintained well enough to prevent the army's movement from creating new enemies. Coalition strategy depended on paperwork and credit as much as on speed. A local magistrate receiving a requisition had little influence over the succession dispute. He still had to decide how to distribute the burden among villages and how to record what the army had taken. The grand strategy reached ordinary government as an account that might never be fully repaid. Prince Eugene of Savoy joined the effort to prevent the Franco-Bavarian armies from concentrating against Vienna. The partnership between Eugene and Marlborough mattered because the coalition divided command and money among national contingents among several governments. Cooperation had to be maintained before tactics could succeed. On the 13th of August 1704, the armies met near Blenheim. The battle was long and costly, but its strategic result can be stated more simply than its tactical movements. The Franco-Bavarian threat to Austria was broken. Bavaria was removed as an effective route for a decisive advance on Vienna, and a major French field army suffered defeat. For the Habsburg monarchy, this preserved the capacity to continue the wider war. Vienna did not have to withdraw support from Charles in order to defend its own survival. Resources could still move toward Italy and Spain. The victory protected a claimant rather than crowning him. News of Blenheim travelled faster as a political result than as a complete account of the fighting. Courts celebrated the removal of danger. Treasuries immediately faced the cost of replacing equipment and maintaining the next campaign. The victory solved an emergency and created a larger expectation that the alliance should now press its advantage. That expectation would later become a burden. Once a coalition proves that it can win, every member begins to ask, which victory will deliver its preferred peace? Blenheim strengthened common confidence, while making the eventual disagreement over war aims more consequential. The result also strengthened the alliance's confidence. France could be defeated in a major continental battle. Marlborough's reputation grew, and the coalition gained leverage in Germany. Yet none of this told a municipal officer in Madrid or Valencia which king to obey. This gap between strategic victory and political control is central to the war. Blenheim altered what France could do in Central Europe. It did not remove Philip from the Spanish throne. A battle could preserve the possibility of a Habsburg king, without creating the Spanish consent and administration that such a king required. The grain receipt near the Danube therefore belonged to two stories. It showed the burden of a campaign imposed on people far from Madrid. It also showed that the Spanish succession depended on whether distant states could keep armies in the field. A village that had no vote in the succession still supplied the operation that allowed one claimant to remain viable. The Allies now possessed momentum, but momentum created new demands. Victories had to be financed. Garrisons had to hold captured positions. The Dutch wanted pressure maintained near their frontier, while the Emperor needed campaigns that protected his territories and advanced Charles's claim. The coalition could agree that Blenheim had prevented disaster. It could not yet agree on how many further victories were necessary. Some governments might be satisfied by barriers and commercial guarantees. The Habsburg court still wanted the throne itself. For Charles in Barcelona, the news meant that his family had survived a threat that could have ended his enterprise. It did not bring him closer to Madrid by itself. His cause now depended on turning a European military advantage into recognition inside Spain. The next campaigns would reveal that the alliance could win far from the peninsula and still fail to govern within it. At sea, however, military success produced something more durable: a fortified harbour that began as part of Charles's cause, and slowly became an interest another ally could keep without him. After Gibraltar was captured in August 1704, a supply officer faced a question more durable than the assault itself. Which government would keep sending food and powder, together with money, to the garrison? The Anglo-Dutch force had taken the fortress in the name of Charles III. The men who held it increasingly depended on English command and naval supply. The assault had been carried out by a fleet-serving Allied strategy, not by a British government already holding an agreed sovereign title to the place. The fortress was proclaimed for Charles, which allowed the operation to fit the public purpose of replacing Philip. The garrison arrangement that followed made the political future less simple than the proclamation. Many inhabitants left during and after the capture, while those who remained entered a town governed under military pressure. The change was immediate at gates and storehouses. It was much less certain in European law, where the question of permanent possession would wait for a peace treaty. The Rock controlled no entire sea, but its harbour stood beside the narrow passage between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. A fleet using it could repair and receive intelligence before supporting operations along the Spanish coast. Possession mattered only if ships and provisions continued to arrive. The capture did not produce a general uprising for Charles. It created a base. This distinction was important. A harbour could be held by a relatively concentrated garrison. A monarchy required cooperation from dispersed institutions and communities. The Battle off Malaga, shortly after the capture, illustrates the difference between tactical decision and strategic effect. Neither side obtained a simple, annihilating victory. The Allies, nevertheless, preserved the maritime position required to support Gibraltar, while French and Spanish forces failed to isolate it from the sea. A sailor carrying stores into the harbour participated in a result that diplomacy had not yet named. The cargo kept an Allied flag above the fortress for another month. Repeated supply gradually turned a temporary seizure into a position that could later be offered, demanded, or refused at the negotiating table. Spain attempted to recover Gibraltar, and the garrison's survival depended on Allied control at sea. Naval operations off Malaga prevented France from easily reversing the capture, though neither fleet was destroyed. The fortress remained in Allied hands because sea power sustained what the initial landing had seized. For Britain, the value of Gibraltar gradually exceeded its usefulness to Charles. A naval station near the strait could support British shipping, regardless of which claimant finally ruled Madrid. This did not mean that British policy had already abandoned the Habsburg cause. It meant that one wartime achievement could be separated from the alliance's declared dynastic objective. A store ledger inside the fortress made that separation visible. Barrels and repair materials arrived through British naval systems. Orders might still invoke Carlos III, yet the practical ability to hold the place came from an ally with its own fleet and treasury, guided by its own strategic interests. This emerging British interest did not require a secret master plan. Strategic value became clearer through use. Admiralty officers learned what the harbour could support. Merchants understood the routes nearby. Ministers saw that continued possession could strengthen bargaining power, even if the larger campaign in Spain failed. The fortress therefore anticipated the later peace. Britain would eventually accept Philip while retaining Gibraltar by treaty. The apparent contradiction was already forming during the war. An ally could abandon the objective of placing Charles in Madrid without abandoning every asset acquired in his name. The war at sea also connected the succession to commerce. Convoys and privateers, together with port access, affected merchants who might never see a battlefield. Insurance costs rose when routes became dangerous. A captured harbour could reduce risk for one side and increase it for another. Allied fleets supported Charles's position along Spain's eastern coast and helped make Barcelona a viable port. They could move troops and supplies more reliably than an army crossing hostile territory. Yet naval access did not guarantee control beyond the reach of coastal guns and roads leading inland. This limitation would follow the alliance into every Spanish campaign. Sea power could deliver a claimant and protect a port. It could not make villages provide grain or persuade a municipal council to collect taxes for him. The distance between a harbour and a kingdom was administrative as much as geographic. Gibraltar, therefore, became a quiet test of coalition unity. The Habsburg cause treated the fortress as territory recovered for Carlos III. British ministers could treat it as a position worth keeping under almost any acceptable peace. Both interpretations could coexist while the war continued. The same process appeared elsewhere. Military cooperation created assets that different allies valued for different reasons. Every successful campaign gave the coalition leverage against France, but it also gave individual members something they might prefer to secure through negotiation rather than risk in pursuit of total victory. For the garrison, these future arguments were less immediate than the next supply ship. A fortress without food would return to Spain regardless of diplomatic language. Its continued occupation proved that Britain could maintain a durable interest on Spanish territory. It did not prove that Charles could maintain a durable government across Spain. The alliance now possessed a base near the entrance to the Mediterranean and a competing royal court in Barcelona. The next obvious objective was Madrid. Twice, Allied armies would enter the capital. Twice, the documents issued there would reveal how little a king possessed when the country beyond the city did not deliver obedience. In 1706, an Allied order in Madrid could bear the name Carlos III, while the wagons needed to support his army failed to arrive. The capital had been occupied, but occupation did not make surrounding authorities collect taxes for the new king. The city showed the difference between entering the centre of government and possessing the networks that made government work. Philip withdrew before the Allied advance and later returned as their position weakened. Charles's supporters could issue proclamations and replace royal symbols. They could not quickly replace the local officials and military escorts, supported by credit arrangements that moved food toward Madrid. Madrid's political importance made its capture look decisive from a distance. Foreign newspapers could report a capital changing hands more easily than they could measure obedience in hundreds of towns. The spectacle of occupation, therefore, exceeded its administrative substance. Charles's supporters also faced the problem of legitimacy after arrival. A king brought by Allied troops needed local ceremonies and institutions to confirm that he was more than the commander's passenger. Where that confirmation remained weak, every royal act depended on the army that protected it. The capital depended on supplies from beyond its walls. If roads became unsafe or communities refused cooperation, soldiers competed with residents for scarce provisions. A government that arrived with a foreign army could not assume that merchants would extend credit or that towns would obey requisitions. The first occupation ended without establishing Charles's rule. This was more than a failure of public enthusiasm. It was a failure to connect the court in Madrid with a reliable territory. The Allies could hold the city temporarily, but their army remained exposed and their administration thin. Philip's recovery strengthened his political claim. He could present his return as evidence that the monarchy had rejected an externally supported rival. Yet the result did not mean every Spaniard supported him for the same reason. Military pressure and institutional continuity both mattered. Local calculation mattered as well. Credit was especially fragile. Suppliers who expected Philip to return had reason to avoid lending to Charles's army. Those who cooperated risked punishment after another change of power. The uncertainty raised prices and reduced the willingness to make long contracts. This made the capital's silence politically important, without requiring us to imagine a single public opinion. Some residents favoured Philip. Others sought safety by responding to whichever authority controlled the street. What the Allies lacked was enough dependable cooperation to make occupation self-supporting. 4 years later, the Allies tried again. Victories at Almansa and Zaragoza opened the route, and Charles entered Madrid in 1710. Once more, the royal title reached the capital before a functioning kingdom did. A municipal order could change its heading in a morning. The supply system could not. Charles needed revenue from territories that did not recognize him, and his troops operated far from secure bases in Catalonia and Portugal. The capital became a position that had to be fed through hostile country. The retreat from the second occupation also exposed the coalition's geography. Charles's strongest institutional base lay in Barcelona, while Portuguese support operated from the west. An army deep in Castile was far from both. Success had carried it into a position more difficult to supply than to enter. Brihuega and Villaviciosa did not prove that every question was settled, but they removed the Allied forces best placed to sustain the Madrid experiment. The capital returned to Philip because military and administrative recovery worked together. The second occupation revealed an even sharper problem. Allied governments could win battles that opened the road to Madrid, yet they could not agree indefinitely on the cost of remaining there. The army's presence imposed burdens on a population whose cooperation was uncertain. For residents, the competition of kings appeared through immediate disruptions. Shops faced military demand. Households might be required to provide quarters. Officials had to decide whether records created under one occupation would remain valid after the next change. Political uncertainty accumulated inside ordinary transactions. Charles left Madrid as Allied forces withdrew. Bourbon victories at Brihuega and Villaviciosa damaged the retreating armies and ended the realistic prospect of holding central Spain through that campaign. The Habsburg court in Barcelona remained, but its reach had again contracted. The two occupations changed the meaning of the war. The question was no longer whether Allied soldiers could reach Madrid. They had demonstrated that they could. The question was whether Charles could make authority continue after the army moved on. This distinction also affected Allied politics. Each failed occupation consumed money and men without delivering the throne. British and Dutch ministers could ask how many more campaigns would be required to convert battlefield success into a Spanish government. Philip survived because his opponents could not make the capital serve as a substitute for the monarchy. His administration and supporters, backed by military forces, could withdraw and return. Charles could occupy the seat of power without controlling the institutions that connected it to most of Spain. The road back east led toward a different consequence of victory. At Almansa, a Bourbon army had already destroyed a major Allied force. Philip's government would use that military recovery, not merely to regain territory, but to change the legal institutions through which parts of the Crown of Aragon had been governed. After the Battle of Almansa on the 25th of April 1707, the town that gave the victory its name still had to count its own losses. Houses had been used and supplies taken. Local finances were strained by armies from both sides. A later petition asking Philip V for relief showed a fact often hidden by victory reports. A town could belong to the winning side and still pay heavily for the battle. The strategic result was severe for Charles. The Bourbon army defeated a major Allied force and opened the way into Valencia. Allied control in eastern Spain contracted, while Philip recovered territory that had recognized Carlos III. The armies at Almansa were themselves evidence that this was not a simple contest between two national populations. Bourbon forces included French and Spanish units. The defeated Allied army contained British and Dutch contingents, alongside Portuguese and other units. Its commander was French by birth and served the Habsburg claimant. Dynastic war crossed later national categories. The battle's importance came from what followed the defeat. A field army that might have protected Valencia was no longer available. Towns and institutions that had chosen Charles now faced Bourbon forces without the same external shield. Military recovery gave Philip something more useful than a returned city. It gave him the opportunity to decide how the reconquered kingdoms would be governed. In June 1707, decrees abolished the public laws and institutions of Aragon and Valencia and introduced arrangements based more closely on Castilian government. The change was justified through the language of rebellion and conquest. Territories that had supported Charles were treated as having forfeited political privileges. This did not mean that every inhabitant had made the same choice, or that every existing private rule vanished. The decrees targeted the public framework through which the kingdoms had negotiated with the crown. The decrees used conquest to answer a question the succession had left unresolved. Could a king, who inherited a composite monarchy, alter the constitutional relationship of territories that resisted him? Philip's government answered through victory. Rebellion had changed the terms on which those territories would be ruled. This was a stronger claim than merely punishing individual opponents. It treated collective institutions as politically responsible for the choice of king. The consequence outlived many of the people who had taken part in that choice. For an official, the change could be seen in the destination of a petition. A matter once handled through a regional body might now pass through a royal structure, redesigned under Philip. The journey of the paper revealed where authority had moved. This was not simply France imposing one model on Spain. Spanish ministers and councils participated in a Bourbon project that sought more dependable royal command after civil war. The result increased administrative uniformity in important areas. But it did not make the whole monarchy identical. A lawyer trained to cite Valencian law could still use parts of the private legal tradition, but the public institutions authorizing and developing that tradition had changed. Continuity and abolition, therefore, existed together. A household contract might survive, while the political body that once represented the kingdom did not. That distinction is essential to the later Catalan decision. The warning from 1707 was not that Philip would erase every local practice overnight. It was that military victory allowed him to decide which institutions possessed public authority. Navarre and the Basque territories, which had remained loyal to Philip, did not receive the same treatment. Catalonia continued under the institutions supporting Charles. Castile retained its own established structures. The war was producing different legal consequences from different records of loyalty and conquest. The consequences reached ordinary office holders. Positions connected to the former institutions disappeared or were transformed. New appointments could favour those considered reliable by the Bourbon government. A legal education suited to one system might no longer lead to the same career. The town petition from Almansa also complicates the idea of a clean Bourbon victory. Local inhabitants could claim loyalty and still ask the crown to recognise the damage caused by the army that had secured that crown. War rewarded political allegiance unevenly. It could strengthen royal authority while weakening the communities expected to support it. For Charles's remaining supporters, the decrees offered a warning. Defeat might decide more than which royal name appeared on documents. It could determine whether the institutions producing those documents continued to exist. Philip's government had converted a battlefield success into a constitutional consequence. That made his rule more effective in recovered territories. But it also raised the cost of surrender for places still supporting Carlos III. A compromise over the king might no longer preserve the previous form of government. The alliance continued to win elsewhere, and French military power remained under pressure. Yet the Spanish centre of gravity was moving toward Philip. His opponents could defeat France in the Low Countries and still watch Bourbon authority become more durable inside the peninsula. By 1709, the Allies would attempt to use their military advantage to negotiate peace. They demanded more than a promise that Philip would leave. They demanded a way to make him leave. The failure to solve that practical problem would return the armies to the field and make another Allied victory feel less like an ending. In 1709, an Allied casualty return and a rejected peace article described the same problem from different directions. The alliance had enough strength to pressure France. It did not possess a simple mechanism for removing Philip V from Spain. Negotiations at The Hague approached a settlement because France was exhausted by war and a severe winter. Louis XIV was prepared to make extensive concessions. The remaining obstacle was enforcement. The Allies wanted Philip to surrender the Spanish throne, and they expected Louis to help compel his own grandson if Philip refused. France's hardship gave the negotiations urgency without making Louis powerless. Failed harvests and financial strain increased pressure on the monarchy. But a ruler facing domestic suffering could still reject a condition he considered impossible or dishonourable. Exhaustion narrowed choices. It did not remove them. The Allied proposal also contained a problem of credibility. If Louis promised to force Philip out and then failed, the war would continue under another disputed guarantee. If he succeeded, France would be spending blood and money to establish a Habsburg Spain that might later threaten French security. That demand turned a peace condition into another war. Louis could promise not to support Philip. Helping to expel him would require French arms to fight the Bourbon government in Spain. The negotiators had reached a settlement whose final guarantee depended on the defeated side undertaking a new campaign. Malplaquet's terrain and fortifications made the Allied attack especially costly. The strategic aim was to open the way toward Mons and maintain pressure on France. The soldiers who crossed the defended ground experienced a victory defined at a level far above the individual unit. The casualty return translated that distance into administration. It did not decide whether the battle had been worth fighting. It made the price available to ministers and parliaments, as well as creditors, who would decide whether another battle on similar terms could be supported. The talks failed, and the armies returned to the Low Countries. On the 11th of September, Marlborough and Prince Eugene attacked the French position near Malplaquet. The Allies won the field and forced the French army to withdraw. They did not destroy it. The cost altered the meaning of the victory. Casualty lists contained the names of men from several states whose governments had already been debating peace. Replacing them required new recruits and new money. A battlefield success that did not compel France to accept the unresolved condition could strengthen arguments for negotiation rather than continued war. For a regimental clerk, the result was visible in empty places. Pay accounts had to be closed or transferred. Units that remained in service needed reinforcement before another campaign. The alliance's victory entered government as a demand for further expenditure. The coalition's problem was cumulative. No single defeat destroyed it, and no single victory completed its purpose. Every government compared the next campaign with benefits it could already secure through negotiation. This is why war weariness should not be understood as simple loss of courage. It was a political judgment about marginal gain. A state could remain hostile to French predominance, while concluding that installing Charles in Madrid was no longer the only acceptable way to prevent it. Marlborough's enemies in Britain could use the cost without denying that he had won. The political question was no longer whether the Allied army was capable. It was whether each additional victory brought the coalition measurably closer to an acceptable peace. The Dutch faced their own burden. The war had protected their frontier, but long campaigns and debt made an unlimited pursuit of the Spanish throne increasingly difficult. The emperor still valued Charles's claim more highly because it belonged to his dynasty. France also remained dangerous. Malplaquet had not erased its defensive capacity. Louis could negotiate from weakness, without accepting conditions that required him to overthrow Philip. The coalition had discovered that defeating French armies was easier than designing an enforceable transfer of the Spanish crown. This changed the role of victory early in the war. Blenheim had prevented Austria from being removed. Malplaquet did not preserve the alliance from an immediate disaster. It asked governments to pay a high price for a strategic result that left the central political problem intact. The war continued into 1710, and Allied armies again entered Madrid before retreating. The repeated failure to turn military movement into stable government gave greater weight to those seeking another definition of success. In Britain, political change during 1710 brought ministers more willing to explore peace. Their policy did not begin with the death of Emperor Joseph I. It grew from domestic politics and war weariness, together with the belief that the existing strategy might demand victories without producing a finish. Malplaquet, therefore, mattered less as a scene of destruction than as a record of diminishing return. The alliance could still win. It was becoming less certain that winning in the same way would secure the outcome for which every member was willing to continue. In April 1711, a letter from Vienna introduced a different calculation. Emperor Joseph I died without a surviving son. Charles, the younger Habsburg prince, once offered as a safe alternative in Spain, now stood to inherit his family's Central European monarchy. In Barcelona, two documents now pointed away from the same court. One still carried the title Carlos III and concerned a Spanish government maintained in Catalonia. The other reported that Joseph I had died on the 17th of April 1711. Charles was no longer the younger Habsburg son, whose principal inheritance might be Spain. Joseph's death gave him responsibility for the Habsburg hereditary lands. These territories did not form one uniform state. Austria and Hungary, along with other possessions, retained different laws and political relationships with their ruler. Charles inherited a composite monarchy before he acquired any imperial title. The Holy Roman Empire required a separate process. Its emperor was chosen by electors and governed through imperial institutions that protected the rights of many territories. Election increased Charles's standing. It did not turn the empire into property. He could command like a private estate. Hungary's relationship with its ruler, for example, could not be reduced to the administration of an Austrian province. Charles had to secure recognition and cooperation through institutions with their own claims. The inheritance enlarged his resources and multiplied the political negotiations required to use them. This complexity made the British fear more subtle than an image of a single Habsburg superstate. The danger lay in one ruler coordinating several monarchies and strategic territories, even when each retained separate laws. The war had begun over precisely that kind of possible concentration. The distinction mattered, but it did not remove the strategic concern. If Charles also obtained the Spanish monarchy, one ruler would hold the Habsburg hereditary lands and Spain's remaining global inheritance. The concentration would differ from a Franco-Spanish union, yet Britain and other allies could still regard it as excessive. British peace policy had already begun to change. The government formed in 1710 was seeking negotiations before the news from Vienna. Queen Anne supported the move, and ministers increasingly questioned a strategy that required further costly campaigns to install Charles in Madrid. Joseph's death gave that policy a stronger security argument. The alliance had fought to prevent the Spanish inheritance from making the Bourbons overwhelmingly powerful. It now had to ask whether complete victory for Charles might create another dynastic combination that required later containment. For Charles, the inheritance did not cancel his Spanish rights. He continued to use the title Carlos III. Officials in Barcelona still issued orders in his name, and supporters who had accepted him through local institutions had received no instruction that their choice was void. Elizabeth Christine's position made the competing monarchy visible after Charles's departure. Petitions could still be presented and officers appointed. Ceremonial authority could also be maintained. Her government proved that physical absence did not automatically end a royal claim. It also showed the claim's dependence on continuity. If the court stopped paying servants, confirming offices, or answering institutions, the name Carlos III would become less useful, even without a formal renunciation. A monarchy could fade through administrative interruption before it disappeared in law. His new responsibilities made absence unavoidable. Before leaving, Charles arranged for Elizabeth Christine to remain as his representative in Barcelona. Her presence allowed appointments and payments. while commands to continue through a court that still claimed to be the royal government of Spain. A payment order illustrates the problem. A military unit serving Charles required authority from a king who was preparing to govern in Central Europe. Without a recognized representative, every delayed signature could weaken the institutions maintaining his Spanish cause. Charles departed Barcelona on the 27th of September 1711. He had not renounced Spain. The journey acknowledged the Habsburg succession and the coming imperial election, not Philip's right to Madrid. British negotiators were therefore changing the test of security. Earlier strategy asked whether Charles could replace Philip. The emerging framework asked whether Philip could be prevented from adding France to Spain. This moved the solution from military possession towards succession law and treaty enforcement. For Charles's supporters, the change looked like a redefinition made after years of sacrifice. For British ministers, it offered a finish that preserved the central prohibition on union without requiring another occupation of Madrid. Both interpretations would shape the distrust at Utrecht. The electors chose Charles on the 12th of October. He was crowned in Frankfurt on the 22nd of December as Charles V. These acts gave him the imperial office after he had already inherited the family lands. They also made the alliance's original alternative king look less politically simple. The reversal was severe. Charles had once lacked enough dynastic power to secure Spain. Now the power he acquired made some allies less willing to secure Spain for him. Strength did not remove his claim. It changed how useful that claim appeared to governments seeking equilibrium. The Dutch Republic did not automatically accept British conclusions. Dutch security still depended on frontier arrangements, and separate British contacts with France created mistrust inside the coalition. A government could favour peace and still object to an ally negotiating without full common control. The Habsburg court saw abandonment where Britain saw recalculation. Charles's supporters had spent years defending a recognised Spanish kingship in Barcelona. From their perspective, his inheritance provided more resources for the claim rather than a reason to surrender it. British and French preliminary discussions moved toward another solution. Philip might remain in Spain if the French and Spanish crowns were permanently separated. Peace would no longer be proved by Charles entering Madrid. It would be proved by limiting what Philip and his descendants could inherit. By the end of 1711, a Frankfurt record confirmed Charles as emperor, while an order in Barcelona could still call him Carlos III. Diplomats now had to build a peace around two claims that neither ruler had personally abandoned. The work would require more than one treaty, because not every government was prepared to accept the same bargain at the same time. When the Peace Congress opened at Utrecht on the 29th of January 1712, a diplomatic secretary could not prepare one document, called the peace. He needed separate drafts for governments with different enemies and demands, with different powers to sign. The most important framework had already been shaped through British and French contacts that not every ally controlled. A draft might contain the correct terms and still be useless if the plenipotentiary lacked authority or the ratification never arrived. Titles also mattered. To name Philip as king was already to concede something. Charles V refused to concede. The secretary's corrections were part of the political settlement, not mere clerical detail. This made Utrecht a process rather than a single agreement. Britain could move toward peace with France, while still requiring another treaty with Spain. Charles V could refuse to sign and remain at war after other members of the alliance stopped fighting. A signature could bind its government. It could not surrender another ruler's claim. The British government also changed the military setting. The Duke of Ormond received orders limiting participation in Allied offensive operations during the 1712 campaign. British-supported forces did not all disappear in one moment, and the change alone did not determine every battlefield result. It made cooperation with Prince Eugene more difficult. On the 24th of July, the French under Villars defeated an Allied force at Denain. The victory did not give France control of Europe. It helped France recover initiative around important frontier positions and improved its bargaining position after years of pressure. Britain could not reduce its commitment to the alliance's original military objective, while assuming that the negotiating balance would remain unchanged. The movement toward peace affected the field, and the field altered what peace could demand. The new settlement no longer required Philip V to leave Spain. On the 5th of November 1712, he formally renounced for himself and his descendants any right to inherit the French crown. The act passed through Spanish political and legal procedures. Philip remained a Bourbon prince. He placed his line outside the recognized French succession. A one-sided renunciation was insufficient. French Bourbon princes also renounced possible rights to the Spanish throne. The reciprocal documents attempted to prevent a future accident of death from joining the crowns through another branch of the family. The legal certainty was limited. French succession principles were often understood to be beyond an individual prince's power to surrender. The negotiators could not create a modern enforcement court capable of deciding every future dispute. They combined domestic registration with international guarantees so that several governments would possess a recognized basis for rejecting a union. The solution did not prove that the crowns could never be united. It made such a union politically harder to claim and more likely to provoke common opposition. Philip could remain because other powers were being given a rule they had an interest in enforcing. The missing imperial signature was therefore a fact the document had to display. Peace could expand without becoming universal. The war's end arrived through overlapping legal relationships, each with its own date and conditions. On the 11th of April, 1713, several major agreements with France were signed. Charles V did not join them. His conflict with France required the later settlements at Rastatt and Baden in 1714. The first Utrecht signatures ended much of the international war without creating one universal peace. Philip received broad recognition as King of Spain and most of Spanish America. He did not retain Charles II's European inheritance intact. Former Spanish territories in the Low Countries and Italy passed into other arrangements, with much of the Habsburg share confirmed through the later imperial peace. Savoy received Sicily and royal status. Britain converted wartime possession into formal rights. In the Anglo-Spanish Treaty, signed on the 13th of July 1713, Spain ceded Gibraltar and Minorca. The treaty made the continued British use of those positions part of the legal peace, rather than merely the result of occupation. The moral distance inside the treaty language is worth noticing. A commercial article could calculate numbers and ports, together with permitted voyages, while the people transported under the contract had been enslaved. The settlement converted wartime bargaining power into a regulated claim over their forced sale. This was not the sole cause of the war, and it should not replace the dynastic question. It shows how a war begun over succession absorbed commercial ambitions, as governments decided what compensation made peace acceptable. Commercial articles reached into Spanish America. Britain obtained the Asiento for 30 years, assigned to the South Sea Company. It was a contract for transporting and selling enslaved Africans in Spanish colonies. Diplomacy treated forced human movement as a licensed commercial privilege. An annual permission ship offered a limited opening for trade in other goods. It did not give British merchants free access to Spanish America. The licenses remained restricted and subject to regulation, but they placed British commercial presence inside a market Spain had tried to control. The Dutch Republic obtained movement toward a defensive barrier, though the final arrangement required later agreement. Dutch ministers had not controlled the British turn to bilateral negotiation, and they did not receive the peace in the same way Britain did. The Catalan issue exposed the limit of compensation between sovereign powers. A port could be ceded in an article. A local constitution depended on the ruler who would govern the territory after the foreign armies left. Britain could request protection, but Philip's government insisted on authority over the internal settlement of his monarchy. Charles did not receive Madrid, but the Habsburg monarchy stood to control important former Spanish territories in Europe. The settlement did not distribute equal rewards. It gave enough major participants reasons to prefer their available security and compensation to another campaign. Catalonia did not possess the same negotiating status. Britain had made earlier commitments connected with the protection of Catalan institutions. The final arrangements addressed amnesty and treatment, but they did not clearly preserve the constitutions and political bodies sought by Charles's supporters. Elizabeth Christine left Barcelona in March 1713. On the 22nd of June, the Convention of El Hospitalet arranged the evacuation of imperial forces and the transfer of positions. Catalan institutions were not equal parties deciding those military terms. A treaty copy at Utrecht could show peace for the states whose representatives signed and ratified it. An evacuation order carried that decision toward Barcelona, where the institutions still using the name Carlos III had received no firm guarantee of their own continuation. The European powers had changed the method by which they controlled the Bourbon danger. Barcelona still had to decide whether that method required its submission. In July 1713, a Barcelona ration register could answer a question that Europe's treaties had left open. How many men should receive bread tomorrow if the city continued the war? Imperial troops were withdrawing under agreements made elsewhere. The register would remain a military document only if Barcelona's institutions chose to keep supplying a defence of their own. That decision belonged to the Junta General de Barrios, which had opened on the 30th of June. Its members sat through the Principality's established corporate order. Not through election by the whole population, their authority came from institutions that still claimed a lawful place within the monarchy, although their recognised king was absent. Arguments for submission were serious. Philip V was gaining recognition, while the forces capable of restoring Charles in Madrid had departed. A prolonged defence could consume the city's resources and leave less room to negotiate. Supporting accommodation could reflect doubt that resistance still offered a practical means of protecting Catalan law. The opposing case began with the weakness of the available guarantees. The peace arrangements did not clearly preserve Catalonia's political institutions. Events in Aragon and Valencia had shown that military victory could be followed by a new public order. No delegate knew a future decree's form, but surrender would leave government in Philip's hands. The junta did not speak with one voice. Town representatives pressed strongly for resistance. Other participants initially preferred submission or approached the vote differently. The resolution emerged from disagreement inside an inherited constitutional system. The decision to resist could also be understood as an attempt to improve the terms eventually obtained. Continuing the defence did not require certainty of victory. It required a belief that immediate submission offered too little protection, and that time might produce assistance or a better negotiation. This calculation was uncertain rather than irrational. Diplomatic pressure could change, and maritime supply had not vanished at once. Yet the governments that had once made Barcelona part of a continental strategy were no longer preparing the forces required to restore that strategy. Carlos III remained the king named by the resisting institutions. Yet the purpose of continuing had narrowed. Barcelona could no longer sustain a European campaign to place Charles on the Spanish throne. It could still use his royal legitimacy to defend how its own offices were filled and how its laws were applied. The claim to Madrid remained, while the decisions still within reach concerned Catalonia itself. The ration register now carried the consequences of that choice. Coronilla service was organised through the city's occupational bodies, and attendants removed people from ordinary work. A man recorded as present for duty also became someone the government had to provision. Each entry connected the junta's resolution to the next distribution of food. The three commons and the city's military command did not form one uncomplicated government. Civil officers had to finance and legitimize resistance, while Antonio de Villarreal judged the military condition. Their responsibilities could point toward different conclusions as the siege tightened. A household following ration rules might also be performing watch duty or losing working time to the coroner. Compliance did not reveal private conviction. It showed the capacity of public institutions to organize behavior under pressure. Beyond the city, the reach of those records was contracting. Bourbon forces extended control through much of Catalonia. Armed resistance continued in several areas, but not under one unified command. Barcelona and Cardona remained the principal fortified positions. Orders issued in the capital increasingly belonged to a government with a smaller effective territory. The Duke of Pipuli's forces began a blockade in 1713. The pressure persisted, although the city was not completely sealed at every stage. During the following summer, French reinforcements arrived, and the Duke of Berwick assumed command. His significance lay in the greater siege capacity now available. As supply became harder, the register asked a harsher question. It no longer merely identified who qualified for rations. It helped measure how much organized defense could still be maintained. Residents who obeyed its rules did not necessarily agree about the war. Their compliance showed that the municipal institutions could still turn limited resources into continued service. Charles Villa had not publicly abandoned the title Carlos III, and diplomatic appeals continued. They produced no relieving expedition. His peace with France at Rastatt in 1714 made another major Habsburg campaign less likely. A royal claim could remain active after its military structure had disappeared. The first post-conquest orders were concerned with control and continuity under occupation. The later decree addressed a more durable question: which royal institutions would govern after emergency military arrangements ceased to be enough. On the 11th of September 1714, Bourbon forces entered through the damaged defences. Antonio de Villarreal and Rafael Casanova were wounded, while military and municipal authorities still attempted to organise resistance. The condition of the city made further defence impossible. Negotiations ended organised fighting in Barcelona. Cardona surrendered on the 18th of September. The ration register no longer determined who would defend the city. Royal occupation brought another kind of record. Within days, a superior board of justice and government began replacing the former political authorities. The consul dissent and the Diputacy ceased to perform their previous functions. Defeat was becoming a decision about which offices could issue valid orders. That change was not completed in September 1714. On the 16th of January 1716, the Nueva Planta decree gave the Royal Audiencia of Catalonia a new form under Philip's government, presided over by the Captain General. The court also exercised an important administrative role. A petition once directed through an older municipal body would now enter a channel reorganised by the Crown. The decree did not make every law in the monarchy identical. Important areas of Catalan civil law continued, although the institutions that had shaped public law no longer held the same authority. Navarre and the Basque provinces retained different arrangements. The monarchy remained internally varied as royal administration became more direct in territories that had resisted Philip. The king in Madrid therefore ruled something different from the inheritance offered in 1700. Spain and most of Spanish America remained under his crown, while important European territories had passed elsewhere. The feared French-Spanish Union was contained through renunciations and international guarantees. Within the peninsula, the war allowed greater administrative uniformity in some regions without creating a fully unified modern state. A royal will had attempted to preserve an entire monarchy by naming one successor. The decree of 1716 addressed the monarchy, produced by military victory and diplomatic settlement. It did not explain why Philip was king. It determined which authority would hear a petition and make its decision effective in Catalonia after the armies had gone.